Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz saxophonist Dave Rempis. He was born in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and began his music journey at 8, inspired by a family friend who played clarinet in local Greek bands, and he picked up the saxophones. And The Muppet Show was also in the mix. At 22, he was asked to replace veteran saxophonist Mars Williams in the well-known Chicago outfit, the Vandermark Five, and things took off from there. Along with concerts and recordings, he's one of the main organizers of the indie rock Pitchfork Music Festival in Chicago. He's a very cool and centered cat, so dig this interview, my friends.
You got a great story. Thank you for joining me here on Neon Jazz. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, thanks. My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Right on. Let me go ahead and start here. I know you're always busy, always got something cooking, but give me, in your own words, kind of a snapshot of what's going on lately.
Well, winter tends to be a little bit quieter season, especially moving into the holidays. So right now I'm working on booking a lot of stuff for spring of next year. I have a trio called Ballaster, which is with Fred Longberg home on cello and electronics, and then Paul Nilsson Love, who's a Norwegian drummer, and we're going to be releasing a new record coming up in January on my label, Aerophonic Records. We're also going to be releasing an LP on a new Belgian label called Dropa Disc, and then we'll be out on tour in Europe in March for about 2 weeks. So kind of gearing up for that. I'm working on a pretty extrapolated solo tour for next year that is going to span the main body of it will be between April and June, maybe with some other stuff later in the fall. But the idea is to travel around the United States, playing solo concerts and kind of developing my own solo approach and repertoire, but also working with musicians in each of the cities that I travel to try to kind of cement some of the musical contacts that, I've made over the years by touring throughout the U.S. The fun part about this will be that, I can actually work with some of these musicians instead of just showing up with my own band, doing a concert, and meeting these folks. It's kind of an opportunity to actually work with them as well. So, pretty excited about those two things. So, those are the biggest things on the radar right now, I would say.
So how does a kid from Wellesley, Massachusetts grow up and get into jazz so much and music?
That's a good question. I was very lucky to have a good public school system in Wellesley and a good band program. And, I first started playing saxophone because my father's Greek, and we had a good family friend who was a clarinet player in Greek bands around Boston. And, I heard him playing from the time I was quite young and got really interested in that. And I was actually also a big fan of Zoot, who was the saxophone player on the Muppets. So for some reason, the combination of those two things led me when I was about 8 years old to almost demand to play the alto saxophone. For some reason, was just, so excited about it. And, my mother wanted me to play flute, which I was completely not interested in. It was like saxophone right from the start. And so starting with that, some of the first stuff you hear on saxophone that's really incredible is jazz, of course. That's who really pioneered how to play the saxophone in interesting ways. I grew up playing in school bands, and I was lucky to have a little community music school nearby. And the guy who was kind of in charge of that little program there was very much involved in the jazz scene around Boston. And so, he really pushed us in terms of improvising. It wasn't like playing big band charts the way you might in kind of a normal school ensemble or something. It was really focused on the type of small combo improvising where you're working on, we do heads and come up with arrangements of those, but the real focus was the improvising and the blowing over changes and whatnot. And that just got me, completely hooked right from the start. I approached it, I think, in a pretty traditional way. Some of the first folks I was listening to were Mingus and Monk and Miles Davis and Coltrane, and, following that chronologically from there, I would say from listening to jazz of the early mid-50s, kind of up through the 1960s, and then as I got a little bit older, starting to push backwards from that period and explore, Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young and Ellington and all the earlier greats. So, yeah, I think that's how I got into it, I would say.
That's a pretty good Wonder Twin Powers there with having Zoot and that cat from the local Greek band. I could just see them two coming together. And
yeah, I would have liked to have been at that jam session, actually.
Yeah. So
yeah.
it's clear that from an early age, jazz has been in your blood. So was it kind of the thing that you knew you were going to become was a musician, or were there? I know in college you kind of switched from classical sax to anthropology. Was music always your dream?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's the thing that really, inspires me. That's where my head's at all the time, is thinking about music, playing music, wanting to duplicate that feeling as much as possible and be on stage working with other musicians and improvising. And, I mean, to me, there's nothing quite like that. But, I do have a lot of other interests as well. And, I mean, I think jazz musically is one of any number of things that inform my music. I mean, dating back to, the fact that my father's Greek and coming out of that culture and, the musical culture that's associated with that. In, high school, starting listening to folks like Eric Dolphy and Yusef Lateef really got my ears focused on, I think, a different approach to playing, to improvising, thinking about harmony and melody and timbre. And, that sort of wove together the cultural background that I came out of and the things that a lot of jazz musicians, began to explore, I think, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And by the time I was in college, I was lucky enough to stumble into a great professor named Paul Berliner, who wrote several books on a number of things. His first set of studies were on the Mbira traditions of Zimbabwe. He went on to write a pretty major treatise on jazz improvisation and had worked with Barry Harris for a long time. He was a great trumpet player in his own right. But that really got me starting to think about, musics of Africa and other parts of the world that still really inform my approach as a saxophonist and composer and improviser.
So what did you learn in college, taking formal classes and really getting into a formal environment? How did that help you as a musician?
That's a good question, because I actually dropped out of music school after 3 months. So from a formal perspective, I wouldn't say that a lot of what I learned in terms of technical approaches or formal aspects of music came out of my college experience. A lot more, I think, of what came out of it was the studies I did in anthropology and ethnomusicology. I studied in Ghana in West Africa for a year. And so, a lot of those things really informed my music, but I think in a different way than had I just been taking, say, theory classes or piano studies, that kind of thing. And, I wish in a way I had taken some of that stuff, but later on, like after college, I think is when I sort of made up for that, just by being out, playing, working as a musician, learning some of that stuff on my own, on the fly, rather than in sort of a more formal setting, I guess you could say.
It's one thing to have talent, and that can take you to a lot of places, but the other thing is also luck. At 22 and 98, you replaced veteran saxophonist Mars Williams in the Vandermark Five. That had to be a pretty big stroke of just good old-fashioned luck right there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was like, I had, I'd seen Ken and Mars and some, all these great Chicago musicians playing around town. And I was at the Velvet Lounge one night pretty soon after I'd gotten out of school. And I think it was DKV Trio with Ken Vandermark and Kent Kessler and Hamid Drake that was playing that night. And I went up to Ken at the end of the night and asked him if I could take a couple of lessons with him. And we'd met once or twice before, but, I got to know him a bit in the process of taking these lessons. And it just so happened that, Mars was incredibly busy at the time and couldn't really commit to the type of touring schedule that Ken was hoping to embark on with that band. And, in me, he saw, I think, a young, decent player, but somebody who, he could work with and who could tour, who had the type of flexibility schedule-wise to do whatever the band needed. And he took a gamble on me, which was a fantastic opportunity for me. I mean, I remember coming home from work one night and hearing this message on my answering machine asking me to audition for the band, and I was like totally floored. It was yeah. Ken was one of my heroes at that time, and was such a dynamic presence on the Chicago music scene. And I was absolutely floored. So.
So since that time, it seems like one thing that's been very paramount with you is that you're always involved with groups, whether the quartet, the engines, you've been in duos. There's been so many things that you've done. How does that all fit within your music diet? I mean, you're a solo cat as well, so how do all these things fit into your psyche? Do you need to have the variety to keep you going, or is it just something that happens?
I think it's a combination of things. I mean, on a basic level, is somebody who really focuses on improvisation. I think working with as many different musicians as possible all the time helps to inform my own development as an improviser, and helps give me new perspectives and ideas on what's possible, and really keeps things fresh. Also, on a practical level, we don't really exist in a day anymore where you can just have one band and take that on tour all the time. It's a time period where I feel like most jazz musicians and improvisers are working in a lot of different contexts. And on a practical level, it's just easier to book different projects. If you're trying to go out on the road or something, the presenters in the U.S. aren't going to present the same band every 3 months or something. So it's good to have different projects for that kind of practical reason as well.
So you've had a lot of collaborations and gigged with a lot of people like Joe McPhee, Nels Cline, Roscoe Mitchell, Hamid Drake. What do you learn from big shots, and more specifically veterans that have been around for a while? I know by osmosis you have to soak in a lot, but what just kind of directly do you get that makes you grow not only as a musician but as a person?
Man, that's a great question. I think one of the things about playing with some of those really heavyweight folks is just their presence, I mean, both as musicians but as people. I mean, I think Hamid is an incredible example of that. I mean, he's a drummer who's played with, literally everybody under the sun, Don Cherry, Pharoah Sanders, you name it, William Parker, for years and years, is a very close collaborator. I mean, he's worked at the top echelons of the music for a very long time, and seeing somebody like that who's been through all this and still has this like incredible positive energy that he puts out there, that's just incredibly inspiring. I mean, it's being a musician is not always an easy lifestyle. You're on the road all the time. You're doing one night stands. You're doing these kind of brutal, crazy travel days and whatnot. And, to feel this kind of sense of history, but also the sense of like positive energy that these guys are, so dedicated to what they're doing that they continue doing it for decades. I mean, that's incredibly inspiring. And, as an artist, that's like certainly what I aspire to. Musically, I think with each of those folks, not just the folks you just mentioned, but any of the, sort of the, legends or long-standing greats of the music. I mean, I think they all have their own things that they do that are particularly interesting, and that's what makes them great. So that varies from person to person, but generally I think it's just this attitude and commitment and, just sort of positive energy that people are willing to put out there for such a long time. That's what's really inspiring about that. So.
Right on. One of the defining elements of you is your diversification. And one thing since 2002 is that you've curated a weekly concert series on Thursday nights for the Elastic Arts Foundation. How did this come about, and how does this fit in with how you approach the world as an artist?
Oh, man, that's a really great question. I mean, I think in jazz and in improvised music, sort of the more, I don't know, leftist cousin of jazz or something. I think we've learned over the past 10 or 20 years that artists really, at this point, have to take responsibility for presenting themselves and their music, and we can't just depend on, club owners or other people to take care of that for us. It's really up to us to decide the contexts that we're going to perform in and how we're going to present our work. And I feel very lucky being from Chicago where, I think the AACM and other musicians in the 1960s really pioneered this approach, and it's an approach and aesthetic that has informed what's happened here for 50 years or more, and is still living strong. I mean, I think some of the best performance venues in Chicago are all artist affiliated or artist run. In my case, this actually grew out of a group of friends in college who just decided after college that they wanted to have a performance space and rehearsal space where, they could do some recording, they could rehearse. Some of the people were musicians, some were theater people. And it went from being a very informal thing to developing over the last, 18 years, basically, into a formal not-for-profit organization, with a board and, that's applying for grants and doing fundraising and all that kind of stuff, and really focused on programming, and particularly programming emerging artists, people who are workshopping, learning about themselves, learning about their work, and developing things that they can take outside of Chicago onto a larger stage around the world. And, that's what I would say my series on Thursday nights at Elastic Arts has been focused on. And I think our programming there generally has been focused on, is really that developing artist type of thing. I mean, it's always great when we can have, Bobby Bradford or Roscoe Mitchell or Peter Brotzman or somebody, some big heavyweight guy come in and do a concert. I mean, we all love that, but the real bread and butter of what we do is, when we have 20 people there on a Thursday night for a 23-year-old musician who in 5 years is going to be a real hotshot. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing, as far as me is concerned, as much as I love jazz, I love the indie music scene, and I always think that if the world understood the amount of talent that went in to not only the jazz world, but into the indie music scene, there would be no worry that music is not going to evolve in ways that we can't even imagine as time goes forward.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And one thing that you have done is you're one of the main organizers for the Pitchfork Music Fest, which I've been a big fan of. Just the whole idea of Pitchfork is great. So how did that happen? Talk to me a little bit about the history of this.
That's funny. So my friend Mike Reed, who's also a drummer, runs a couple of jazz venues in Chicago, but back around 2005 came up with this harebrained scheme to start basically an indie rock festival. And at the time, I was bartending at several rock venues in Chicago that were run by medium-sized national presenter called Jam Productions, which for a long time has been one of the larger rock concert presenters in Chicago and regionally in the Midwest. And so I had some experience working, both rock venues, but working outdoor events for them also. And Mike came in and asked me to run the concessions for the what at the time was called the Intonation Music Festival, which was curated by Pitchfork. And then the next year, we changed the name to Pitchfork Music Festival, and I took on the larger role as sort of the business manager for the whole festival. And it just kind of built up from there, basically. I mean, we at the start had sort of an idea of what we're doing, but we're really learning on the fly, and thankfully it's been something that we've been able to build up into a pretty well-known national event, and it's been a fun and interesting. I don't want to say distraction for me, because it's certainly more than a distraction, but it goes hand in hand with my music stuff, I would say. It's my own artistic endeavors, basically. So
right on. So let's follow this baton of live music here and get into the realm of jazz and all of the people that you've considered jazz heroes over the years. If you could get into that DeLorean, punch in the digits, and go back in time, who would you want to see live in the world of jazz, and where would you go?
Oh, man. Where wouldn't I go? I mean, okay, the obvious choice would be New York, of course, but, what would actually be really interesting in the United States is to go to some of those, regional centers that back in, like, the 1930s were, really important centers, whether it be Minneapolis or Kansas City or, places all around the country that had very significant impacts on the jazz world, particularly at that time. Another place that I think would be interesting would be Paris in the 1930s or 1950s, or Copenhagen in the 1950s or 60s. There's been amazing stuff happening all all over the place. And, you know, as a Chicagoan, it's certainly, you know, people do focus on New York, and of course there's amazing stuff there, but there is actually amazing stuff happening all over the place. So, but yeah, that is a good question.
Well, the one thing I do want to ask as well is it's a very simple question, but why do you love jazz?
That's a great question. I mean, to me, I think it comes down to improvisation and the feeling of you know, just jumping in head first and not knowing where it's going to come out. That feeling of, you know, just total risk and willingness to accept greatness and also to fall flat on your face. The highs are incredibly high and the lows can be low, but you know, the highs really make up for it. I think it's a special thing when a band really is clicking on all 6 cylinders and just, you know, creates a music out of the air that just makes sense.
So with all of the clicking and all of the fans that you've played for, what's one of the best compliments you've ever gotten from a fan?
Oh man, that's a tough one. That is a tough one. I don't know how I would answer that, but I will say just every once in a while I'll get an email from somebody through my website that says, you know, you don't know me, but I just want to say your music means a lot to me and thanks for making it. And just the fact that somebody would reach out, you know, on a blind level and you know, pay that compliment to me, that's so inspiring when that happens. I mean, that's something that like really keeps me going as an artist. Yeah.
So let's say we hook up in about 10 years and I ask you first thing like I did at the top of this interview, what's going on? What are you going to want to tell me's happened? What are you looking forward to?
You know, that's a good question, but I tend to not make game plans and I try to follow where things are going. And in a way, like you just said, with the indie rock scene, it's like people are out there doing this work and things change, sounds change, and it happens in an organic way. And I'd hate to put some set of expectations or template onto that rather than just follow where things are developing organically. You know, I think that's an important thing to sort of accept and realize is that, you know, you've got to follow these general movements, which are not just related to the art itself, but they're related to the larger culture at the time, the politics, you know, everything else that's happening around you. So I think it's tough to say, you know. I'd love to be just working as a musician and making a living full-time as a musician and playing 250 concerts a year. We'll see if it happens or not, but I'm going to play it by ear, I guess.
Sounds good. So let me ask you this. Everyone has a version of who you are, your family, your friends, your business associates. But when you wake up and go out in the world, who do you think you are?
Man, I got to say, I still feel like a 22-year-old kid who's, you know, like rediscovering this thing every day. Joe McPhee is a good friend of mine. Often tends to say after gigs, "Thank you for extending my childhood to the audience," and I love that because that's what it is. You know, it's like every day wanting to feel like a kid again. So
that's beautiful.
In my head, I'm 22 years old.
That's cool. I always remember when I was I took a poetry class in college, and there was an old woman in there, and she had to be in her 70s, and everybody went around and said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And of course, UMKC, everybody, the clientele is older, so everybody's already doing what they're doing. They're just going back to school. So they got to this old woman, and she just said, "I don't want to ever grow up." And just the way she just said that, and that was it. It was that one sentence, right. And the profundity of how she said it, and the way she said it, and the smile that everybody. It's like that's it. If you can keep your youth, you're good.
Totally.
You know.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, I feel very lucky. You know, working with some of the older musicians I work with. You know, guys who are still out in their 70s, who are still out touring regularly and hauling their gear around on trains and planes and automobiles, and. You know, I feel like many of them, I have to say, are in physically and mentally better shape than other folks I know of the same age. And I think it's just because they do continue to engage with the world as a creative force and in ways where they're looking out and bringing in new information and influences. You know, I used to see Fred Anderson play all the time before he died in 2010. he was somebody who was still practicing his entire life till he passed away, was out playing, was out working with new people. And every time I saw him play, it wasn't like there was some seismic shift in the way he played, but there would be like one small new thing every time I saw him play. And, this real process of slow learning and unfolding and grinding and pushing, it's like a tectonic thing almost in a way, but it keeps you growing, and it keeps you fresh, and it keeps you creative. And that's my goal. If I can be doing that when I'm 75, 80 years old, I will be incredibly happy. So,
Dave, thank you for opening up. Thanks for the music, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Chicago, New York, KC, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Dave for his time and his honesty. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store, or visit theneonjazz.blogspot.com for all things Neon Jazz, and you can even visit neonjazz at youtube.com. Until next time, enjoy the music, my friends.
Neon Jazz.